Okay, so we're currently at 50. So shall we start, Kayleigh, and then hopefully others will join.
Good afternoon, all.
Good afternoon. My name is Ama and I am Head of Culture and Wellbeing at Mental Health First Aid England. Kayleigh?
And I'm Kayleigh Hemmings. I'm the HR Manager, also at MHFA England.
And Kayleigh and I both work in the people team. So today's webinar, you can go to the next slide, please. For today's webinar, you've joined us so we can talk about mental health, the mental health effects of organisational downsizing. So we hope to discuss in this webinar psychological safety and the overall impact in downsizing, the importance of applying a mental health and wellbeing lens throughout the whole process, and also and factors to consider when you are making the decisions pre, during, and post your downsizing process, and the support you should provide. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to kick off first of all to share some insights on some sector spotlights. I'm not entirely sure who we've got on the call, but actually it'd be great to actually see if any of those sectors, or just to drop in the chat box throughout the course, throughout this webinar, what sector you belong in. But the focus today, we're looking at predominantly retail, hospitality, events. I'll also be looking at legal and financial services. But just to share some really interesting sector spotlights, 36% of employees have been diagnosed with a mental health condition when you're looking at the retail and hospitality industry. 31% of retail managers feel the situation arises every day in which they put the interest of the businesses ahead of employees. If we're looking at events, 70% of employees felt that there's a stigma around mental health, whilst 35% are still reporting that they have no workplace facilities or services that could support their mental health. If we look at the next sector spotlight, when we look at finance, legal, and media, the percentages are slightly higher, but irrespectively, they are still alarming. So if you look at financial sector, 64% of employees have experienced a mental health issue as a result of work. If we're looking at legal, 93% of junior employees have experienced stress in the past month. And 74%, that's nearly a quarter, say that the employees provide no help, support, or guidance around mental health in the workplace. When we look at media, 59% of PR communication employees have experienced ill mental health, with 57%, which is over half, would be uncomfortable or very uncomfortable talking about mental health in the workplace. The reason why I'm sharing, and we are sharing these statistics with you, is predominantly just to get an idea of what those industries are going through in terms of the employees being employed in those industries, how they feel about mental health, and how they can actually feel comfortable enough to communicate or share, or if there's any support available, which is very crucial to, if you are thinking about downsizing, whether now or in the future. Thinking about these sector spotlights actually will make you think about what it's like within your own workplaces, and predominantly some of these individuals probably are part of your employee workforce. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this is a very interesting mental health map, and it was a survey done by Stay Nimble, and it was actually done this year around Britain's redundancy health map. So whether it's unexpected, whether it's expected or sudden, redundancy can cause huge uncertainty, stress, and anxiety, and can also make existing health problems worse. So if we kind of looked at sort of some of the areas within that map, East, which is predominantly sort of, there's a huge pressure around stress within South and Southeast. If you're looking at places like North, West, Wales, there is currently sort of no change, but there is things around anxiety, depression, and panic attacks. So that kind of gives you a really good insight at the moment at how the temperature gauge of mental health and well-being across the UK and how people are feeling. We can go to the next slide, please. So I've set the scene with all those statistics and just given you an overview of what it looks like in the current state and our current climate. And before we go on to our next main piece, which is looking at downsizing, the actual dilemma, I would like to know, with a poll, how likely are you to start restructuring your workforce over the next 3 months due to coronavirus. Oh, I think we put up the wrong poll. Alex, if we can have the other one about just finding out how many people, just to sense check. Again, it's just to get a gauge and an idea so that we can, of course, tailor this webinar accordingly. So is it very likely, somewhat likely, neutral, somewhat unlikely, very unlikely? Just give a couple more seconds and then we could probably share the results. Okay, that's actually quite a good spread with the majority of you are very likely or somewhat likely to look into it, or very neutral. So actually it's really good to see the population, and actually it's suited, you're very much suited for this webinar then. I do think that, you know, we do hear across the board on the news and media on a daily basis that organizations are looking at redundancy and are looking to reduce their workforce just due to coronavirus. So I think that is very much a shared dilemma across the board, irrespective of what industry you are in. So if we move on and let's actually get into some nitty-gritty of what we're here to talk about today, we're looking at the dilemmas that come with downsizing. And obviously, you know, there is definitely a legal way to process of how you have to deal with things anyway. So that is not necessarily the conversation here. The conversation we're having today is very much around, in that process, how do you think about and what should you be thinking about from a well-being and perspective, which also kind of connects to inclusion perspective as well. So some of the important questions, if you are thinking about it, if you're in the process, to always ask yourself is downsizing truly necessary? I think that is probably for most organizations, the end result or the last result. But I think always questioning along the way is downsizing your workforce truly necessary? Can you make sacrifices elsewhere? So having a full list and full review of your entire workforce and also the entire processes, systems, where you're spending your money, how you're spending your money. Looking at that in a bit more detail will also ask, where can you make the sacrifices? Where are there more pinch points to do? And also, are there other options to reduce costs? So in essence, you know, your goal should be to think about how do you distribute the widespread of negativity in a much better way, and actually are there other options for you that allow you to do that? We can go on to the next slide, please. And the reason it matters is, you know, the financial impact of coronavirus on businesses is stark. So many of us and many businesses will be facing downsizing their workforce. But also financial impact will also impact the workforce in itself. So that is an area to think about. You know, I think on the left of the slide, you will see there's some revenue and cost analysis in terms of how we were doing prior to Q1, and now we're sort of going towards Q3 and Q4. We will be dilapidating some of our revenue. So, you know, the job market in the next sort of 6 to 9 months, there will be a downturn. You know, unemployment will be high, and, you know, again, there'll be probably freezing on hires, etc. So, you know, this is a very unsettling period for what the workforce entirely and employees entirely. So it's kind of thinking about, again, where does that impact lie? You know, the key thing, and I think the major thing, which we'll go on to talk a bit more about, is around the psychological safety. So there already is psychological safety in the insecurity of whether you know, employees are still going to have their jobs or not by the end of the year. So I think, you know, job insecurity, things like negative financial well-being, unemployment, these are all factors that are increasing stress and also increase mental health and well-being. You know, and I think the key thing which you should definitely be thinking about in your processes is that mostly when you do redundancies, diversity and underrepresented groups are mostly impacted by the process. So how do you ensure that when you are looking at your pools of candidates for redundancy, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, that they are not disproportionately disadvantaged as a result? We can go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned psychological safety. You know, psychological safety is defined as being able to show and employ oneself without fear of negativity, consequences of self-image, status, or career. So when you then apply that in terms of what influencing factors of psychological safety might play in the redundancy process, any organizational change is unsettling for any employees. The fact that not everybody takes well or does well with change have to come into that equation. But when the more risk adverse or the more high the risk of change, the more impacts on well-being. So, you know, for employees that are already managing mental health issues, you know, this can make the symptoms even more worse. But for employees that have probably had underlying issues that have not been exhibited, again, situations like redundancy can escalate that. So I think through any sort of thoughtful planning, execution of effective communications, engaging with the employees to explore maybe how they can handle the change in a psychological safety way, being transparent as soon as possible, and then as early as possible, and continually being transparent through the process will also help. You know, I think that it's very interesting when we look at these sections and situations in terms of what psychological safety means. You know, it starts with you. You're always thinking about how that impacts you individually. You know, the personal triggers, for want of a better word, that factor that are uniquely to you in terms of how you behave, how you react, and how you deal with things. When you look at trust, there's a very huge thing about sense of belonging. So very much around just within your workforce and within your work environment and culture, there's a huge thing around psychological safety and having a sense of belonging there. In terms of autonomy, it's the need to feel that we're in control of our choices we make and the environments that we're in. So again, when you're looking at downsizing, that choice is taken from you. So again, how do you navigate those conversations, those consultation conversations with individuals and groups to ensure that there's some element of control? When you look at fairness, again, coming back to being treated fairly and others are being treated fairly as well. So making sure that, again, your process is as fair as possible. And then when you're talking about security, it's the need for stability and consistency. Now, this is very interesting because obviously when you're talking about downsizing and redundancy, how does security come to play? And that comes to the point when I was talking about through good planning and very much effective communications. The more you communicate and the more that you provide in terms of information and support, then individuals do feel that they have that security in place. And in terms of esteem, it's again how we are regarded and that we're regarded highly by others. So how do others see us? So obviously with those that are impacted by downsizing or redundancies, they probably question a lot about their identity and whether they were good enough in the first place. So these are things to be quite conscious about when you are dealing with individuals when it comes to downsizing, because psychological safety is the biggest point where that will decide whether an individual or how an individual deals with mental health and well-being through the process. If we can go to the next slides, please. So not only does downsizing impact, obviously, the workforce, it also stifles innovation. You have an area where you're talking about, risk-averse survivors. So there's a very key thing around when you're thinking about downsizing, the main focus is always around who is leaving and exiting, whereas actually you should also think about the survivors, because sometimes with survivors, there will be survivor guilt. There'll also be that sort of back of mind thought of actually, could I be next? And that, again, would stop them from thinking about how they are productive going forward. So there's a very key thing around how you make sure that you are still looking after the survivors that remain to reintegrate them into the organization, but also keeping sure that you're supporting them to actually, again, help them through the process. There's also a lack of resources for innovation. If you are downsizing and you're not hiring, there's a lot of influence on how much work that people do, and also the creativity that you might have lost through the workforce that have exited the organization. So again, there's a lack of resources there when it comes to thinking about new innovation. There's very much low levels of employee morale and enthusiasm, because as I said, those survivors that remain will be thinking, okay, well, is this the last round? Will there be more? What does that mean for me? Are there any more changes coming along? So again, managing that is very crucial to the point, to the part of the process as well. And also being very conscious that if you are having people that are exiting the organization, but you're not rehiring, that workload will be a surmountable issue to think about. So what you don't want to do is increase workloads where it's necessary for them there be more pressures on mental health and well-being, and then actually impacting productivity. So how you reallocate workload, how you reallocate roles, and how you reallocate responsibilities is also quite crucial in that, when you're thinking about it post exiting the individuals that will no longer be in your organization. If we can look at the next slide, please. So having set that piece around, things to think about, things to consider is the employee psychological safety is already being impacted and over concerns of job security. So, we've been through and we've been living with the coronavirus now since the beginning of the year. We've been all working from home remotely and in different ways. Whilst lockdown has been eased, the last 4 months have been quite an incredible journey that we've taken. And actually during that 4 months, when people have been fed from various outlets of media that, we're hitting, the economy is being impacted, that, jobs will be impacted. This conversation and these thought processes have been happening well before you're probably thinking about it. So I think the key thing around this quote is very much understanding that, through it all, the piece around psychological safety should not be downplayed. Next slide, please. And I think we're going to ask the second poll. So in total, UK companies are set to make many job cuts during coronavirus. How many do you think that is? We've got a selection of answers that you can choose from, if we can have that. Do you think it's between 0 and 20,000? Do you think it's 20,000 to 40,000, 40,000 to 60,000, 60,000 to 80,000, or 80,000 and more? If you could have a guess, we'll give a couple of seconds on that and then we will share the results. Shall we share the results? Alex, please. Okay, so 45% think it's 80,000 plus, 19 think it's between 60 and 80, and 24% think it's 40 and 60, and then we've got 9% for 20 and above. And then between 0 and 20, we've got 3%. So actually, in total, UK companies are set to make a collective of 68,090 job cuts due to coronavirus, and they're cutting 103,90 roles overall. So yes, those that are saying 80 plus, it's very much within that region, but also to date, it's been within sort of the 60 to 80 plus. So there are going to be a lot of downsizing going on. It's just the nature of what we're dealing with. But I think what it's interesting to know that it's pretty much across the board in different sectors. There are probably more sectors than some that probably be experiencing it more, but this is just to show you the impact that coronavirus has had on businesses to date. So what does that mean? So I discussed previously some issues around mental health and how that could, some of the things that came up were around job insecurity, etc. But when you think about it, it's all around stress and probably will manifest around stress. So when you think about the stress container, which will show you some different elements of what happens when you're thinking about when our stress containers get filled, there's things that come into play. And if we are not able to release those things or deal with them, they get overspilled. So, I mean, some of the issues that have come up are debt, health, marriage. It could be finances, bereavement, workplace stress. These are all relationship problems. They are day-to-day things that happen on a daily basis that either escalate your stress levels or deteriorate your stress levels. So, when that overflow problems develops, you get emotional leaks, and then you have a lot of issues that come to that point. So it's thinking about how you can have some really good coping strategies to unblock the tap so that you release things out and, have less stress. So losing a job can cause a range of feelings, but the most common is feelings of shock, unworthiness, loss of purpose and confidence. And in some areas, it can lead to the development of depression and anxiety. Redundancy can deal a heavy blow to mental health, causing, like I mentioned, depression, low self-esteem, anxiety, and stress. So having to deal with the sort of day-to-day life hacks, as I like to call it, or life issues, on top of them having to think about, whether you're at risk, really does have an impact. And the reason why we show this stress container is that it's really helpful to see how things build up really easily and can escalate really quickly, and how then to think about the strategies and coping mechanisms. So when you are dealing with individuals that are going through this redundancy process, again, it's thinking about what support can you provide, which my colleague Kayleigh will talk about later, to make sure that they have the best support possible. And I think what's really interesting about the redundancy, and I've been talking about those that have been involved in the process, but there are actually audiences that you need to consider as well, which are not just those people that are at risk of losing their jobs. If we can go to the next slide, please. So when you're thinking about your downsizing choices and dilemmas, before in some of the previous slides I shared with you, we talked about thinking about how you can do things differently. I think, the last alternative should be redundancies, but there are probably things that you could consider exploring and looking into before that. And there are things like natural wastages. So where are you losing money where you can actually save money a lot better? Are there opportunities to have recruitment freezes, stopping, reducing overtime, offering early retirement to volunteers, obviously subject to complying with the age discrimination, retraining or redeploying some of your employees, reducing working hours, moving to part-time working as an option, offering existing employee sabbaticals or secondments, having a pay freeze, working from home so you can release your office space if that's an opportunity, if it's not needed, kind of going out to that, and also thinking about just ways in which you can just change the ways of working and how people work. Those are some of the suggestions specifically that we would recommend, and probably it's a conversation, right? So we mentioned before having effective communication and probably involving some of your employees in the process if you can. So thinking and sense checking some of these choices with them, how many employees might want to take that up, could also help you think about how much you apportion to actual redundancies versus alternative choices. Can we have the next slide, please? Key mistakes to avoid, however, are, making sure that it's a first response rather than a last resort, failing to involve employees in the search of ways to reduce cost, wastage and inefficiencies. I think we don't do that enough. I think we kind of tend to, as many organizations do, we kind of just tend to hold this within HR because we don't want to, again, raise hopes or make people anxious beforehand. But I think there's a really good piece around involving some of your employees in some of the process before actually making the final decisions. And they actually could come up with some really creative, tangible, really good actions and choices to make you to think about before actually heading down the route of downsizing. I think the key thing that we also underestimate is the damage on company culture. So how you treat your employees during this process, whether they are exiting or surviving, is quite key to your reputation as a brand and your culture as a company. Failing to change the what is done and how it works, ignoring the effects of, on your customers and suppliers. Again, thinking about the end user in all this as well. Is it appropriate? Failing to communicate the situation appropriately and effectively and transparently is also a key thing. Neglecting the well-being of those leaving and not re-engaging with those that remain, and as a result, those that are left behind feel flat, deflated, unmotivated, and don't want to work. These are all key things that you should really be bearing in mind, especially when it comes to the company culture piece and psychological safety. And when you communicate, how you communicate and who you involve in that process as well. Can you have the next slide, please? So I mentioned earlier about, we always tend to think about just those that we are leaving or the employees that are exiting the organization, but there actually is a cycle and a circle in terms of who your stakeholders and audiences should be. And again, as you are mapping out your process pre, pro, during, and afterwards, it's really crucial to know that these are probably the people that will be impacted the most. you need to communicate. And again, it comes down to, as I keep saying, communication and making sure that you are communicating efficiently and effectively. It's not just the employees who leave, but also, as we mentioned before, the survivors who stay. It's the managers. So again, what are managers' roles within this? What are they going to do post that and during the process? Obviously, you have your HR directors and HR advisors that are pretty much crucial to this. Also, the CEO and the exec team are also affected and impacted. If you're going through a whole redundancy, it's not usually just one group of people that gets impacted. So I think thinking about C-suite and the exec as well, but also what role they are going to be playing within these processes too, if they are going to remain in the organization. And obviously family and friends and members of those who are made redundant. I think it's also an element that we need to think about. I know most of our EAPs in some organizations extend to family and friends, but again, it's thinking about what that support looks like and how you support those individuals. And actually, if you can support those families and friends as well in the process, it's actually, it's really good that you do so. If you can go to the next slide, please. I mentioned underrepresented groups in one of my earlier slides, and I really want to focus on this for a few minutes because I think it's really crucial that just as you would look at your processes when you're doing succession planning, you should look at it from an inclusion lens. The same thing should apply when you're looking at it from a downsizing lens. There are some vulnerable groups that you need to be very aware of to help mitigate circumstances around mental health. And that's the groups that have felt that they have been marginalized, whether it's through diversity or oppression. We've got ethnicity and BAME groups, lower paid, those who have existing mental health, those that have a disability, if you've got any elder or older people that work in your workforce, any carers or parents, sole earners. I think making sure that you plan how to monitor these redundancy pools by diversity and marginalized groups will also help avoid those groups in vast numbers exiting the organization. Particularly if you're looking at lower paid, where can you get your bigger bang for buck is the question. And looking at it very much that, when you look at it from an inclusion lens, a lot of the roles that are from sort of probably admin to manager, senior manager level have a majority of population from either BME or ethnicity or a diversity group or background. So again, rechecking your pool to ensure that they are not impacted, asking the right questions, and actually really analyzing whether this is the right level of people to exit your organizations is very crucial. So I can't say enough around the impact on vulnerable groups because they're probably the most that are actually end up being part of the process more often than not. We can go to the next slide. And I believe the next slide is around support and resources, which I will hand over to Kayleigh to talk you through.
Hi all, just to reintroduce myself, I'm Kayleigh Hemmings. I'm the HR manager at MHFA England. I'm going to talk a bit about the support and resources through downsizing. So next slide, thank you. So this is a quote from Zoe Ogden, who is the HR director of Uni Days. She goes on to state that compassion is of the utmost importance during this period, just to ensure that the exiting employees can transition as painlessly as possible. And I think it's really important to note that these are still your employees throughout this period up until their leave date, and going through this this process can be quite emotional, so it is important to support them all throughout. Let me go to the next slide. So this is our final poll, but it's at more of a Q&A. So if you could put any of your answers into the Q&A button at the bottom. So the question is, what do you think is the most effective resource that you can or have provided for your employees during downsizing? So if you could put in any of those, and we're just going to have a little look. I'll give you another minute on that. So we've got early engagement and comms, honesty, MHFA does, outplacement programs, authenticity, open communication, weekly check-ins. Those are some really good answers, and we'll go over in the next slide some of the things that you can provide for your exiting staff. So it is quite good practice to ensure that during the redundancy process that you have a good mental health and wellbeing support approach, which is proactively provided for your staff. So this can include things such as mental health first aider and things like time set aside with HR, with managers to support your staff throughout the process. If it is an organisational wide process that you're going through, it might also be beneficial to have somebody outside of the organisation so that people don't feel like that you know that it's part of the process, but a safe space outside of that process that might be quite helpful. Obviously, financial well-being is quite important during this because you know your financial income will be stopped. So really laying that out would be really important. So making sure there's a set out process of what that would include. And making sure that, you know, if you can provide a enhanced offer, that would be quite good for all staff if possible. But you'd obviously have to talk to your finance department in order to make sure that that is possible. Making sure to signpost employees to any outside financial resources that they can apply for after they have exited the organisation. Any support for job seekers is key. So this can include development days, which could be, you know, CV support, support with a careers advisor, also support with interviews and practice. So that can also be quite useful. A process that kind of gives people choice is always best practice. So that could be things such as voluntary redundancy, whether people would like to go part-time in order to cut down on costs. So having the choice really benefits staff's psychological well-being. And I think one of the most important things throughout the process is to have a genuine two-way consultation where feedback is actually responded to. Sometimes you can adjust your plans or the structure of a department if necessary, as this could lead to not only better trust, but also more sustainable ways of working in the future. And next slide. So in order to sort of retrain existing staff with goals, so this can help sort of bring the rest of the remaining staff on board in terms of having a very clear way forward. Providing placement counselling, as mentioned, so information about alternative job opportunities in the community can be provided to them, and that you can work with local partnerships in order to do this. Providing support for remaining employees. This could be things such as your EAP system, or providing a counselling service in-house to support them through the process. And any other links to community support services is always very useful to consider. It's always good to sort of monitor the redundancy pools. So as mentioned by Ama, making sure that you are making it as fair as possible and considering those of a marginalised groups as well. a good send-off, I think, is quite important for those exiting the organisations, to make sure that they have felt valued throughout the process and their time working there. And it's good for sort of a reputational impact as well. Sort of clarities and goals to re-engage those that are remaining in the organisation. So making sure that you have a re-engagement with the mission, the vision and the values of the organisation, to really boost that staff morale for those who have remained in the organisation. And to make sure that you really acknowledge the contribution of those who have exited the organisation is key. One of the things that Ama mentioned, of course, is the survivor syndrome. So that is quite common for those who have remained in the organisation. So really making sure that you build in those morale boosting exercises and activities is key, and to make sure that those are built into the redundancy plans as well. And I'm going to hand back over to Ama.
Thank you, Kayleigh. Just go quickly through this and then we can open up for Q&A. So we've been, as you know, we've been doing these summer webinars just to give sort of free advice to help people in different subjects and topics. And as an organisation, we are thinking about how we can support other organisations think about or apply the mental health and well-being lens in all their people-centric processes or all the things they do from a people perspective. And we were looking to trial and launch leadership labs to help actually support organizations think about the process, because we do understand that sometimes you can get very much in the detail without actually, and you might need some support to think about things in a different way. And obviously we are very much in our element when it comes to mental health and well-being, in the sense of, you know, supporting and giving resources around that we're wanting to trial and pilot a leadership lab. And we're looking at launching it around mental health and the economic uncertainty, which actually also plays into a lot of different topics. So not just downsizing, but also thinking about from a people-centric piece, as we continue to go through and having to live with coronavirus, what are the things that might come into play that will impact the employee experience and the employee journey? You know, so obviously we're kicking off with job security, because that's one of the key things in financial well-being, but we hope to also offer a series of different topics to then play out in the lab. So if you are interested, or if this does intrigue you or interest you in becoming part of our pilot, please do contact us on the email below, which is workplace@mentalhealthengland.org. And I will say no more about that. But again, I think it's going to be a really great way. We're trying to make things be more around experiential learning for leaders in whatever level of the organization that you are, to just think differently about how you approach the employee experience from a mental health and well-being perspective, and apply that with the lens through whatever you do, thinking about the impacts thereafter, to make you think about, are the processes and systems you have in place and the support valid or relevant, or should you be thinking about a different way of doing it? So on that note, I think we can open up for Q&A now. Are there any questions that you would like to ask, or any comments?
Any questions on processes, on procedures, on support of well-being?
Were we that thorough? Oh, I see two questions coming up. Hang on, let's see. Okay, so Andrew, question from Andrew. What are the main sorts of requests that you are getting from organizations at the moment? It's a question from Andrew, and a question from Paula is, we are currently going through a downsizing within our group. We have 32 marked at risk with over 50% expected to go. Do you have any advice for morale and cultural support internally? And then we've got a third question. My company is going through redundancy consultation for which I'm an employee rep, and this has been really helpful, from Emma. Thank you, Emma. I'm glad that you found this really helpful. So, okay, should we take Andrew's question first? So what are the sorts of requests that you are getting from organisations at the moment?
I think one of the things that we have been getting, and things we have always gotten, but is quite important right now, is to how do organisations support their mental health first aiders. So you have to remember that these are people who are trying to help others, but those that help sometimes also need help. So making sure that you are checking in with your MHFA aiders, or those who are on the sort of front line of the face of, I suppose, the downsizing. So those in HR, and making sure that they are supported with their mental health through the process as well. So that's quite important to remember. Anything else that you can think of, Ama?
No, I think those are kind of the key things. We've also, I guess the question is very much around how do they utilize their mental first aiders to support if they are still part, or if they're not affected by the process, but also thinking about what stages to actually to start the conversations at. So I think for us, it's very much, as I mentioned, as soon as possible, and the more transparent you are, I think, having an employee rep is a great idea. Emma mentioned that she's one, and so again, how do you train up, but how do you skill up and train up your employee reps to ensure that, again, they are being supported from a mental health perspective, but also a mental health and wellbeing perspective, but also they are equipped to support those that they are representing as well. So it's been mainly that, what you've mentioned, Kayleigh, but also very much around what support systems could they put in place that are not already in place, and how can they think differently about the approach. I've got here, do you have any advice for moral or cultural support internally, Paula? I think that's a very good question, Paula. I think from a cultural perspective, there's sometimes inevitably this is going to happen and people are aware. I think for us, what we have done, we've been open around just everything we're talking about. I'm not saying about downsizing, but I think we use our full team meetings to update our staff on what we're doing next, how we're going through things. So I think as a cultural perspective, if you've got a forum that enables you to update your employees and staff with as much information as possible, but also for them to ask questions around the process, that actually supports, that helps as well. I think that I can't re-emphasize enough the things around communication, but also those that are involved in the process. So for example, HR that is involved in consultancy, employee reps, etc., that they understand their roles and there's clarity within that role management, so that people understand what their expectations are and how to deliver that, and also the support that they can have if they are unsure. So I think, from a cultural perspective, again, the support is very much, we always talk about EAPs, but I also think, are there opportunities internally for you, again, to think about how you can galvanize moral support within the employees? So again, diversity, if you've got any networks internally that, again, people can have open spaces to talk about things. If you've got a mental health first aider network as well, using them as a support is quite good. But I think the crucial thing around culture is around transparency and authenticity. And actually, if you're talking about redundancies, the fact of the matter that it's happening, people need to understand why, and actually just understand each step and each process. So communicate at every step and process. So I don't think it's a question of, okay, this is happening once and then no communication at all until the next thing hits. I think you should be communicating so employees understand what's coming next and understand the options that they have that's coming next, but also the support that that's provided to them. So for cases, we mentioned financial well-being, which I think will be a huge impact factor on redundancies and downsizing. If you don't have that already, thinking about outsourcing that or getting someone in to help your employees think about their financial state and what they can do to prepare themselves to be better, or offer that as a package of development or outsourcing is quite helpful. So I think thinking about things that would impact lifestyle immediately will be helping in terms of supporting this. And if your EAP doesn't have that, then it's a question of finding another vendor or source that can provide that for you. I hope we've answered that question. Kayleigh, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
So I think in terms of sort of like the morale part as well. So for those kind of after, I think, you know, as mentioned, it is about making sure that the goals, you talked about the role clarity, the sort of mission and vision of the organisation going forward. I think that really galvanises people after the fact, you know, after the downsizing has happened, to really make sure that they all have a goal and a focus. So I think that can help with morale sort of after the fact.
I've got 2 more questions. I think actually there's quite a few. Oh, there's let me see. So we've got, of all the content today, what would be your top tip for HR professionals supporting this type of process, please? And that's from Christine. Kayleigh, do you want to go first? And then I could add to that, or?
Yeah, I think it's about making sure that you know, as Ama mentioned, making sure that you are in constant communication with people, so that they don't feel like they're being left behind in the process. But I also think that, you know, it's about consulting with maybe project managers, maybe heads of department, however you structure it, to allow time in your timelines for projects, for you know, work to be done, for there to be a bit of a dip, because once people know that you're going through a redundancy process, it will affect productivity. And that's not a bad thing, because people do need to process this. You know, we're all humans, and we need to go through these processes. So it's about allowing people to have that time, because they're going to be, however you're going to, you know, do that process. Are they going to be applying for it? Are they going to have to do applications? Are they going to have to do interviews for any of the existing jobs in the structure? So I think it's about allowing people to have that time, allowing them to go and talk to other individuals. You know, so I think that's a tip to think about.
You know, absolutely. I agree with that 100%, Kayleigh. I think, and also depending on whether you are doing your redundancies in one go, or if you're doing the portion, so you're doing it kind of in phases, particularly the phases, you will need to think about what culture and environment you're creating through that, because the change has not happened and then you've moved on. The change is constantly there. So I think in both areas that change will look very different. So thinking about, again, how that's going to impact productivity is very key, because irrespective of what way you're doing it, you should be allowing some time for people to deal with the process and manage the process, and also give them time, you know, and that support if they are exiting, for example, what that looks like, and allowing that time for that. But also if they're survivors, again, what do their new role, have their roles changed? What does that new environment look like? And I think there's almost this sense of having to rebond and re-emphasize your values. Whatever you do throughout this process, you have to remember that as an organization, you have a set of values and cultural drivers that you have said that you are as an organization. So remembering that through that process as well, and how you then support people through those values and the descriptions of behaviors that are used during that process will also be quite impactful. So I think definitely thinking about just how people will be dealing with this process. And obviously there's that curve of change, of grief, so not everybody will be going through it the same way. Is how do you give those support circles, but also the time and space for people to come through to it. Yes, we know that you're still a business and you still have to do business as usual, but you have to also think about that, because if you don't get that right, it will impact your business as usual and the productivity thereafter anyway.
Definitely.
Kevin has said, I think the law against discrimination during downsizing should be front page news at all time. it is against the law. Yes, it is. And I think if you do it wrongly, what you will do is end up facing a tribunal or some sort, and you just don't want to do that. And even more so, that fact, you don't want to end up in newspapers as an organization that has done it wrongly. You know, there are outlets nowadays that enable employees to talk about their experience. For example, Glassdoor being one. So again,
or even Twitter,
you know, the social media has made things very different now. So I think you definitely have to think about the reputational damage that is at cost, that will be at cost to you, which is much more harder to fix than anything else. But also I think it's just, as a human nature perspective, to do the right thing. And I know that sometimes we do get caught up, like I say, in the detail, or in the fact of executing things that we don't think about, things that we should be thinking about, or when we do think about them, we dismiss them. I think it's really crucial when you're thinking about whatever process you're going through, whether it's redundancy, reducing time, whatever it is, that you have that empathy, but also think about it from that well-being perspective.
I think it's important to remember, like, how you can unintentionally discriminate as well. So things like, are you getting rid of all part-time employees? That could disproportionately affect, you know, women with children. You know, are you looking at, you know, just make sure that when you're looking at things such as those who are on, you know, in the admin or something like that, on the lower paid jobs, you know, it could be because they're starting out in their career, so that could be age discrimination. So it's really important to analyze the data of your pools before you know, make those decisions, because it could be something that you hadn't considered.
And I definitely think, to add to that, Kayleigh, is to check your bias, because, and the decisions that you're making, are they the right decisions? Why are we making these decisions? And also probably to sense check those decisions with other colleagues or peers that are involved in the process, because, like I say, you can get very much linear in that stuff, and you want to avoid that. Katie has said, great session, thank you, Katie. I'm not sure we've fully anticipated the potential mental ill health fallout from COVID-19. It's great to have more mental health first aid across organisations. However, I think we need more prominent leaders to be speaking out about lived experiences and encouraging people to bring their whole selves to work. 100%, Katie. You're definitely speaking to the converted when you say that. I agree with you, and I think there is something around leadership and vulnerability that we don't see a lot of sides to that. And I think that leadership should be more open with some of the lived experiences to talk about their experiences, so that people can actually understand and see that it's not just happening in certain pockets in the workplace, or certain pockets in society. And I think, you know, COVID has definitely put mental health and well-being on the spotlight that it's never done, like it's never done before. And I think there's a really good way, and I'm kind of segmenting into the next question that Mary, you asked, but it is a really good way of, it's made us have to think about things differently. In the past, where we talked about, oh, it could not be done working remotely from home, we've all had to do it for the last 3 months, in some cases really good, some cases really bad. But the fact that we have been able to do it shows that where there have been barriers, because again of decisions or whatever thought process there might have been, those barriers have been kind of dismantled in a way. So I think that I do agree with you. I think there needs to be more stories, and more diverse stories about shared experiences. But you know, again, that is a work in process. And as an organisation, that's one of the things we would love to be able to do, is share the spotlight and share and showcase these stories. So Mary, Kayleigh, did you want to jump in there, or did you?
I think you answered it perfectly.
So Mary, your question was very much around, you know, you said that companies should think about downsizing as a last resort rather than the first step. To me, this is a big change in culture. Have you got any advice on how we could encourage company directors to think differently? Kayleigh, do you want to take that question and I can add in?
I think that if you're talking to directors, unfortunately, you always have to take it back to money, and it's always about return on investment. So, you know, the biggest asset for a company is their staff, their employees. It's estimated that, you know, each hire is worth between £3,000 and £10,000. for each person that you recruit. So I think it's about, you know, recognizing that staff are the doers, they are the company, and unnecessarily getting rid of people who are, you know, aligned with your vision, your values, and who are, you know, the doers of the work in your company. It should be the last resort. You know, there's lots of other things that you can do. So talking to your finance department to see what could be cut down. Things such as, you know, looking at your service contracts, outsourcing. There's lots of other things to consider before that. It should be the last resort, and that's because the people are the company, really. Do you want to expand?
And I think that's very true. And I think to add to that, I think what happens is we get into this mode of finding a solution straight away without actually brainstorming what could potentially happen first. So the first thing we hear is like, okay, we need to save money. So the first thing we need to do is, okay, we need to get rid, for want of a better word, or we need to kind of downsize and make the salary pocket less, or whatever our outgoings are. So the first thing you think about is, to do that, is that you have to downsize. Well, actually, it's not. You could actually find really creative ways to half your salary bill if that's the issue, or, you know, to save money in other ways. But we don't always give time for that brainstorm to happen, and we don't always think about who should be involved in that process first. So my advice to you, Mary, would be is to try and encourage directors to think differently on that note, to do kind of a sense of an audit check to say, actually, well, what could we do less of or not spend money on to begin with? And actually, if we do that, it's almost like scenario planning, right? So it's like, if you think about it, what are the different scenarios that we could make us effectively save money at different stages before we have to go down the route of downsizing or making our workforce less. And actually, if we're going to go to downsizing as an option, as a last option, let's offer. I mean, some people might want to go down part-time. Some people might want to do reduced hours. Some people might want to job share. It's a really great opportunity for you to look at your culture as it is now and think about how can you make that truly an inclusive workforce or truly an inclusive environment to deal with. You know, if you're doing remote working and you've got buildings, half the people probably are worried about coming back to work anyway because we're still having to deal with coronavirus. So is it that you could use your buildings in another way where, you know, if you're delivering training, you can actually have those, you know, use your buildings for that sense? You know, there's different ways to think about it. I just think we don't have the space to think, okay, well, this is the situation, what are our options? We just go straight to wanting to solve the solution, and the solution is always the impact on the workforce. So I would encourage you, Mary, to really think about how you can get directors in the room, and maybe it's through one of our labs or something like that, to make them really think about it differently amongst their peers and to think about the different scenarios. And I know we're kind of at time.
We've got a 2-minute warning.
We've got a 2-minute warning. So I know there's a few more other questions, but Mary, I hope that's given you some food for thought in terms of just how do you encourage directors to think differently. But for the questions that we haven't answered, we will be answering them offline. In some shape or form. I need to check back with the team, but I'm pretty sure we're told that for any question that we don't answer, we will. I know we've got one more about if senior leadership teams are if senior leadership team are to sign a DNA around redundancies, how can you offer support to those for carrying out the process on the front line? And I think that could be either a last question we answer now, Kayleigh, or we take offline to answer. But that was
yeah, I think it goes back to what I was saying about those, you know, who are kind of become the face of the redundancy, I suppose. It's about making sure that you have somebody who's designated to be that MHFA or that support, and if that's not possible in-house, then to provide it externally, and to have that trusted person externally that they can talk to. So I think that is key, because they need to think about their mental health through it as well, because a lot of people will be looking at them to give guidance, to give leadership, to communicate in the same tone as an organisation. So that also carries a lot of weight to it as well.
Yeah, especially those that are sort of employee reps or the frontline piece. And I agree with Kayleigh. I think it's having your regular check-ins with those individuals. How are they doing? How should we support you? What are you finding that, it's always checking in with whoever's frontline and having to execute whatever position or responsibility they have, is to have regular check-ins with them to find out how you can best support them, how they're coping, what are they finding difficult, what do they, what is it that they can do that's supporting extra. And again, coming to Kayleigh's point, if there's something you can do internally or help them externally, that is a great way to do it. But I hope you have found this session and webinar really useful. I agree with you, Sean. I think mental health and wellbeing needs to be a standard item on all your meeting agendas, or regular wellbeing check-ins should be something that should be expected of all managers to deliver. Yes, thank you all for your time. And I think we might share this deck. I'll have to check. But anyway, again, if there's any questions that you have that need answering, you can also email to workplace@mentalhealthfirstaidengland.org. But we hope you have a great afternoon, and take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.